Hey folks, Kevin here. It's October 25th, 2019. I'm out in the gazebo taking advantage of one of the last days in fall before the snowstorms come here. But I wanted to do another episode of Ask Me Anything. Recently, an older video of mine about how quickly do wood chips decompose has gotten some more attention, and I'm getting more comments and questions about that. And so today I'm doing another episode of Ask Me Anything, and there's a couple of questions somewhat related to that video. So the first one's from Cher Yang. Where can I get wood chips cheap? And someone had responded, go online to go to Chip Drop. And Chip Drop is an online resource for those people, and I think it's predominantly in urban areas, where they'll be in touch with either the municipality or the tree services or landscaping places that will let them know that there's a person that has chips. Now there's a person that wants wood chips, and when you go on, and I signed up to Chip Drop a few months ago, and I never got any responses from them. Now I'm out in the country, and there are many tree services around and all, and I'll go through some of the things I've done to get wood chips and all, but I've never had success. But if you're in an urban setting, it's very likely that you'll be able to get chips dropped. And they will help you to differentiate whether you want to whether you can take some chunky wood like logs with it, or potentially stump grindings, those sorts of things. So you can differentiate. I have two tree services that come here now. One who's semi-retired, and so I only get a couple loads a year from his tree service. And the other tree service, they're local here, and if my place is closer to where than another place for dropping chips, he comes here regularly. I could use, at the rate that I'm getting chips from my primary chips resource, I could easily triple or quadruple the number of loads that I get. That's how much I really rely upon the wood chips. But things I wrote down here, a couple things. Check with your city. Sometimes there's offers from the municipality, like in Fulton, New York, not too far from where I live. The municipality picks up curbside leaves and brush and those sorts of materials. They also do wood chipping and stump grinding, and they allow tree services to dump in a location on their site. And you can go, if you've got a pickup truck or if you do have bags, you can go and pick up wood chips from your local municipality, potentially. Certainly, there are many other resources, such as this time of year in deciduous forests, like we live in central New York. The fall is a time with all the leaves drop. It used to be real easy. I'd go into town with my dump trailer and pick up all the bagged leaves, but the municipalities want people to just rake them into big piles alongside the road, so that their skid loaders can grab those, dump it into a big front end loader, and then dump it into their dump trucks and bring it to their sites. So it's much more difficult. You have to bring rakes and shovels and all to load up. But there may be people who are depositing bags of leaves and twigs and sticks and fruit and their old plants as well. So that's another potential resource. Certainly, contacting people in your neighborhood who have garden waste as well. Those are things that can be used for building soil. And I'm deviating from the specifics of wood chips, just because these are other resources that you can use. Or like, we contacted coffee shops, and we were able to get one coffee shop we provided the buckets to save the coffee grounds for us. I contacted all the restaurants around us, and none of them were willing to save. They said it's just easier for them to put it in the dumpster. As climate issues become more apparent and more relevant to restaurant owners and all, those resources may be used as well in the future. Certainly cardboard and paper products. These are organic. These come from trees. We use those tremendous volumes of newspaper and magazines and journal articles and cardboard boxes, shipping containers as well. They also help to build soil, and they create great habitats for microorganisms and for inoculating fungal organisms, and that's one of the ways that we get large, deep wood chip beds to convert into soil a little bit more quickly. Another thing, Craigslist is all over the country now, so putting an ad on Craigslist or in the local newspaper, calling up tree services, landscapers, and saying, do they ever get extra wood chips? And if they're in the area, you need to have, one of the things I would say, if you're going to be using a tree service, be aware of their concerns, where you want the chips dropped. They want to have a nice, easy access to it. They don't want to be going onto lawns where they have to worry about someone's septic lines being there, or driving over an area and getting stuck. On these larger tree services where you see the big the boom lift that's also attached to the truck that dumps the chips, well, that boom which carries a person that can get raised up to the level where they can use a chainsaw or use tools to limb the trees, well, that boom basket that's on a hydraulic arm has to be moved out of the way before the truck can actually dump. So overhead wires and trees, low limbs and all. It's not readily apparent to anyone until you really take a good close look at one of these trucks, especially when they're dumping. They don't want to be worried about having someone being upset with them when they come and drop their chips. They don't want to get stuck. They often will have employees who aren't as knowledgeable as them. So it's one of those things with making your site as attractive for them as possible, and you can get some good wood chips. Those of us who live in the country, we often have places that are easy access for the wood chips to get dropped. And certainly, again, chip drop. I think it's chipdrop, all one word, .org or .com. You can just search that on Google. Let me see. I'm going to ask and see what another question is here. Okay, Earl Shine had commented on one of my videos. Thanks for the drone footage of the greenhouse. Any plans to cover and use only the part near the adjacent building, the work area? I'll be making a video pretty soon, just sort of wrapping up this season, how far I've gotten and all. Unfortunately, since I work by myself, and the Solex, which I'll go over, and being up on these roof areas with the wind that we get here, it can make me airborne and allow me to get injured. So I have to have multiple days of very calm weather where there isn't ice in the morning from the frost and all, so I can safely do this work and get the roof on by myself. So I've decided, since I have so many other projects going on, and we have the dew and the frosts in the morning, and we have relatively short days, and this is the time of year when our winds pick up and all. So I won't be working on it. I won't be able to get that front area enclosed for this winter. Hopefully, if things work out well, next season I'll be able to get the roof on it, and we'll be able to take it from there as far as getting the structure enclosed. And I anticipate there'll probably be 6 years of me going over the modifications, the automation, the AI that I'm hoping to incorporate, where the systems recognize me, recognize faces, read all the dynamic factors that are going on in the environment, temperature, humidity, wind velocity, all of those things. And we try to get the building dialed into what we want it to do to make it as usable as possible in the future. So thanks for the question, Earl, but I'm too slow and working by myself here. Jim Wilford asks, hi, great video. I am in Southern Oregon, an urban backyard guy of 80 years. Excellent. good to see, and hopefully you're working with some young people around you that can gain some experience from your years of experience as well. But very into permaculture beds. Last year I built new beds on grass covered with cardboard and the lasagna layers. Amazing production. Right now I'm starting to convert my old garden to a permaculture one. This requires fewer layers, I understand. But do I chop and drop old plants and then add compost, then mulch, or question mark? And so the question I asked was, what will you be growing in these beds? And the response was brassicas. And then I asked, what climate zone, what are your rainfall requirements as well? And Jim wasn't able to get back to that. So I thought what I'd do is make sort of a, now the beds that, for the most part, when you look at the permanent raised beds that we use here, you see my large composting videos that I've done. Those of you who've been around for a while, if you haven't, I'll try to put a link to some of the large composting video series. I've done several of them where I explain thermophilic and the microbial communities, temperature. I certainly explain about weed seeds in composting systems. I've done a whole series on composting weeds. I've talked about composting animal feces as well, where you have to worry about pathogens and how we achieve that. So that's a whole couple of video series that I've done on composting. But our permanent raised beds in our gardens are raised beds, and I'll explain why it's raised beds, but these are geared after Elliott Coleman, Jean-Martin Fortier, Curtis Stone also does, he doesn't do the raised beds, but he does do permanent beds. And this is what I'll be doing for the next few years, and ultimately we'll be going into cover crops being used in all our beds. And I've done a recent video with using the weed mats and all, so for right now I'm using permanent raised beds. I absolutely love them, and they work fantastic in a cold, temperate, wet climate like we have in central New York. So I live in Oswego, New York. So if anybody who's watching this can look that up on a Google map and see about where we are. But when we're talking about permaculture beds as opposed to market gardener beds, so I'm building market gardener beds, and those are the ones you've seen with my garden beds. Now if you go back several years ago, you'll see some of my permaculture beds, but most of my permaculture beds are part of the food forest as well. So those are more perennial beds with some annuals, self-seeding annuals as well. And I hope I'm not confusing everyone with this, and I can see this is going to be another long video. So what are our goals? So one of the things is growing brassicas. So brassicas require a more bacterial-dominated microbial community within the soil, as opposed to a food forest. A food forest, in order not to have weeds or undesirable plants in a food forest, we want the soil microbial community to be predominantly fungally dominated. Therefore, while we use lots of highly carbon-rich materials, paper products, cardboard products, wood chips, straw, old leaves, fallen leaves where they've lost their pigment as well. All of those materials help to enhance the transition, the soil transition from being a bacterial dominated soil to a fungally dominated soil. So if we want to grow brassicas, we want mostly bacterial dominated soil. Now the first thing that I was thinking about when I was first trying to decide what's the best orientation for the garden beds, what are the best materials, how much time and effort is put into establishing a bed versus how much time is necessary for maintaining the beds. So and one of the reasons why I asked about rainfall, it's always important to be thinking about evaporation or transpiration versus rainfall. So during the whole photosynthesis process, there's these little pores on the surface of leaves that transpire. They take the moisture that's within the plant from the root systems, and it goes out into the atmosphere. So in high windy areas, or in areas that are rather arid and don't get much rainfall, then the way that we're going to orient our beds and how we're going to design our beds is different from like this climate, which is a more cold temperate climate. So we have more rainfall compared to evaporation or transpiration. So that's really important. So in this part of the country, we use permanent raised beds. The raised beds allow us to have our beds dry out much easier and warm up much easier early in the spring after all the snow melts and after the spring rains. So those raised beds help us to get our transplants and our seeds into the ground earlier in the season. And we have short growing seasons, which our summers aren't, we don't have as many warm days as possible. I'm going to stop for a second and mention one other thing. When we look at climate zones, like we're in zone 5A here, but zone 5A may be down south from us in a mountain range as well. So when we're talking about zone 5, zone 1, zone 9 and all, we're talking about the number of hours of chill hours. So that's really important for our fruit trees that require chill hours. It doesn't talk about how much heat is here. So I'm in zone 5A, but there's people in zone 5A who will have fantastic ability to grow bell peppers all summer long. They'll have so many nice warm days, but they have the same number of chill hour days that we have here in our zone. So I hope that makes sense, because often people will think that the zone that you're living in, and I'm talking about the climate zone, that's going to tell you about that they're all comparable, and they aren't. It's just about the chill hours. I apologize for taking that deviation, but I thought it would be an important point. So when we're in this area here, since I'm in a cold temperate climate, two things I want, and we have more rainfall than evaporation, I want my beds, if at all possible, facing north and south, because the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. With those beds being oriented that way, that allows us, each one of those rows, to get as much solar exposure, unless there's a really tall plant right next to another one, or there's a building right next to it, and I can go over that in other videos. But all of the plants will get the equal amount of solar radiation. The beds will warm up at the same rate as well. Now, the slope of the land is also extremely important. So the slope of our property goes from our northwest corner to our southeast corner. So I modified the slope of where all the garden beds are so they just slope to the south. So with my beds being north and south, the paths, which are lower than the raised beds, when there's heavy rainfalls, and I'll post a video I'll link to a video in the upper right hand corner to the flood that we had. We had 4 inches of rain in less than 3 hours, and it exceeded the absorptive capacity of the beds. So all of the paths had water rushing down the paths because the paths were oriented in a north-south direction. If I were on a steep hillside, I'd put my beds on contour to prevent erosion. So, and if I was on a hillside, a steep slope that was in a dry, arid environment, my beds would be cut down and my beds would be sunken and my paths would be raised. If I was on a steep slope and I was in a higher rainfall area, then I would have my beds raised on a steep slope, on contour, with my paths lower. That helps to secure the soil so that we have less chances of erosion, and we can get our beds oriented appropriately. If I were on a relatively flat with a minimal slope part of the country in an arid area where evaporation exceeds rainfall, then I would also consider putting my beds sunken, certainly sunken, and potentially on contour as well. Just trying to gather as much moisture as well. So I wanted to give those two things, so exposure to the sun and orientation of the beds, and using rainfall and rainfall versus evaporation and the severity of the slope as helpful determinant factors on how to set up your garden initially. If I were, I should have said this too. Let's say I was in an extremely hot environment in the south, where the evaporation it far exceeds the rainfall, then I would consider also changing the orientation east and west so that I could take the benefit of having having more shade. Because we're in a cloud-free environment and a very hot, arid environment, I would change my orientation of my crops going east and west so I could have the taller crops to shade out some of the other crops, or some of the food forests shading out some of the other crops, to reduce the amount of transpiration evaporation. And if I was in a really high windy zone, I'd be putting trees or living fences or hedgerows on the sides where the high winds are coming from as well. And I know this is getting to be too much more than what the question actually was, but I wanted to mention those things. So when I think of building permaculture beds, I'm thinking about going cheap, going easily accessible, or things that we can get our hands on really super easy. And I think about doing things sort of in this way. So if you've got a grass lawn or an old garden bed, the first thing I would do is gather up those organic materials that can be laid directly on the grass, whether it's chicken manure or composted materials that you've got as well. But I'd be putting, like this time of year, I'm grabbing all my tomatoes that landed on the ground, all of my brassicas and crops and residue that were in my beds, but maybe your neighbors have that. Maybe they have leaves that they've gathered up as well. Any organic material that will break down rapidly would be awesome. Your kitchen scraps, all of those materials. So I'd lay that right on top of the lawn or the area that you want to do it. And we already covered how you're going to orient the bed and whether it's going to be raised or sunken based on rainfall versus evaporation. So I'd lay that right on the material. I wouldn't dig. And all right, so why not dig the soil? One, you destroy the architecture of the soil. Number two, you disrupt the amount of the microorganisms that are in that structure as well. And as a result of that, some of the things that happen is you expose weed seeds, which are already there, and weed seeds need warmth, moisture, and many of them need solar exposure. There's these little color receptors that take certain wavelengths of light, like the red wavelength of light, and that changes this protein conformation on the surface of the seed, which allows the seed to start to germinate. And it can be just 1 second, or it may be 20 seconds or 30 seconds that light has to be exposed to it. And when you're digging or double digging or whatever, you're giving these seeds a chance to get the programming to start to germinate. And I like to keep all of the root structure and all of that material in there and let the microbial communities be there, as long as it's not soaking wet and you can do aeration. And I've talked before, I've done videos on using the broad fork to increase aeration, open up the area so we can get air down into the soils as well, because we want air, including nitrogen and oxygen, to get down into the soil as well. Then once we have all this vegetable matter, kitchen scraps, coffee grounds, materials, you may go to a coffee shop, you may have a restaurant that's nearby, whatever I can get to lay on top of the grass or lay on top of the old garden bed that's there, get that down. The next thing is doing sheet mulching. Sheet mulching really provides a few things. One, it inhibits the germination of seeds. It decreases the photosynthesis, so some of the small seedlings that have already germinated aren't going to get the light that they need to survive, and they'll die. Some of the perennial things like the quackgrass and the bindweeds, they're still going to be a problem in those areas. But if you start digging them up, you'll break them up into segments and you'll have twice or quadruple the number of problems as a result of that. So you get all your organic mulch material down, then you sheet mulch it. And you can use paper, you can use shredded paper, you can use whatever. The idea is to get it fairly thick to give the earthworms and the microorganisms a chance to do all the work down below and then work their way through all those paper products as time goes on, and your garden is a bit more established. So you have it sheet mulched very well, and then on top of that you start adding your mulch, whether it's straw or grass clippings that you've dried out or whatever it may be. And the thicker you put it, the better off it is. All right, so the paper products below that mulch are going to delay the moisture getting to the subsurface. So again, those seeds and weeds and grasses need that moisture, need that sunlight in order to survive. By having a thick sheet mulch layer down there, the cardboard and paper products, that delays the absorption, the transfer of water through that paper product. Yes, that paper product will get saturated, but it'd be a bit drier underneath that paper product. And if you need to, do an experiment in your art so that you can see this. Then the thick mulch, the hay, the straw, the grass clippings, whatever it is you put on top of that cardboard product, the thicker it is, well, that's going to help to insulate, decrease the coldness of the really cold days and decrease the warmness of the warm days. It's a layer of insulation. It's a layer of moisture retention. So you're maintaining a higher moisture content above the level of the cardboard and paper products, and you're increasing the insulation blanket there to make the plants that you plant do real well. Then once you've got all of this material, this hay, straw, grass clippings, whatever it is, you separate little pouch spots out, poke a hole through the cardboard that's the size of the transplant or the seed that you want to put in. Put some good compost in that small area and put your seed or put your transplant right in there and snug up the mulch around it so that it not to the point where it doesn't get the sunlight, but that way you're going to have to water those plants less. They're going to be less challenged by thermal shocks, whether it's a high heat of a hot sunny day. You can just make the mulch a little bit higher around it so that it's not getting burnt when you first do the transplants in the spring, where they haven't been hardened off enough. Or it'll help to prevent them from getting damage from a frost as well. Those are all things that I think about the permaculture way of establishing garden beds. And you're feeding all of the earthworms and the microorganisms by putting all that material below all of the cardboard. So as much waste as you can put there, because that's food for all the microorganisms, and those microorganisms are going to feed your plants. Would I be using wood chips in that situation if I wanted to grow brassicas? No. Because that's carbon rich, that's going to be for more fungally dominated organisms later on in the season as everything starts to break down. But Jim also asked about the chop and drop. And one of the things I would say when we're growing annuals and like brassicas that need a bacterial dominated soil, I wouldn't be putting too much woody products into the mulch surface initially. Now certainly you can, especially if you have a combination of brassicas with your fruit at the base of the fruit trees, and we do that here. But I would be doing more green materials as opposed to those brown materials. Or the brown materials that I use would be like leaves or any materials that are carbonaceous, but not super thick, where the fungal armies are going to be necessary to break down those materials. So I'd be using only the new shoots of plants that we're growing. And if you'd like, I can always talk a little bit more about chop and drop and the difference between a tropical region, a cold temperate climate like we are, and an arid region. The timing is important, and that's all I'll say about that. I think I'll stop this video right here and try and record another Ask Me Anything for a couple other questions I got as well. So if you found this video of value, please give us a thumbs up and share it with your friends. I really do appreciate everyone's input and contributions to the channel, your comments, sharing amongst each other. I think really it certainly makes me stop and think about how I should answer some of these questions as well. So thanks so much for watching, folks, and have a great day. Bye-bye now.